each of us is constituted as individual organisms, but our orientation, our duty, is to the whole. And so that's not individualistic. But still, the reality is we are constituted as individual organisms. And that puts limits on how to get stuff done.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. Daniel Klein is professor of economics and JIN Chair at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he co-leads a program in Adam Smith. There's been renewed interest in the role Christianity has played in liberalism since Larry Siedentop's 2014 book, Inventing the Individual: The Origins of Western Liberalism. Today in this episode, Dan Churchwell, Acton's Director of Programs and Education, sits down with Klein to discuss Adam Smith and his enlightenment vision. Building on Siedentop, Klein says universal benevolent monotheism, and Christianity in particular, has led to the articulation of a specific social grammar and corresponding rights. In short, Adam Smith's liberal plan. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Well, today I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Daniel Klein. He's a professor of economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dr. Klein, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
You were able to speak at our Acton lecture series earlier today, kind of on this idea of inventing the individual, Adam Smith, and it was really great, and we really appreciate it. We have a really wide array. Our audience is varied in their knowledge, though, of Adam Smith. Probably, can you just introduce a little bit? I mean, you've written dozens of articles and books on this topic. You even chair a center on Adam Smith at George Mason. So this is your specialty. Can you just give us a little refresher? Who was Adam Smith? When did he live? And kind of why should we know him now?
He was a Scottish moral philosopher, born in 1723. Moral philosophy is, you can think of it as all the human sciences. So it includes history, it includes social sciences like economics and political science. So all human considerations are under this very broad umbrella, all of ethics. So it's just not natural philosophy like physics and astronomy. So he's a moral philosopher, and his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, takes up ethics, and he develops an entire ethical outlook. And it involves a universal benevolent beholder, which he calls the impartial spectator, and it's obviously associated with God. And so it's kind of like a whole framework for ethics. It's very rich and fascinating to delve into, and he goes through talking about all the different virtues and how they play a part in this entire approach. And that broad ethical umbrella developed in his first book really is extended in the second, where the human conduct of particular interest in the second book, the second work, The Wealth of Nations, is the behavior, the conduct of the lawmaker, the legislator. And the question is, what is good government law? Okay? And to answer this question, he realized, as many people in that day were realizing, that they needed to develop the vocabulary of economics. So you see, economics is very much an extension and expression of the basic moral issue about what serves the good of the whole, humankind, and then what decisions, policies are becoming a legislator? What is the virtue? What is virtue in a legislator? Virtue in a legislator is legislating good legislation. What is good legislation? What should you believe? What should you understand? So really, it's still ethics. It's just that the actor now is especially lawmakers, policymakers, and so on. Besides the policy side, there's also commerce per se. So you can think of the merchant. And here he's very much morally authorizing the pursuit of honest income, which means he's saying by an invisible hand, pursuing honest income serves the good of the whole, makes a very sustained, rich case for this throughout the whole work. And so this invigorates economic activity by entrepreneurs, by merchants, and so on. Innovation comes because people are emboldened. They feel they have God's approval to innovate, make money.
You use the term, he's known, several phrases are well known still to this day, but the invisible hand, can what we hear that sometimes, or it's written up in a commentary. What did he mean by invisible hand?
He meant that things flow from the individual's actions that were not intended or not the focus of his action. And the expression generally carries the further connotation of a goodness of things, unintended things. So the innovator, the entrepreneur might pursue honest income, but what he does in the process of that thing he intends to get rich, let's say, is that barefooted kids now wear shoes and have their teeth fixed. The great enrichment. That's an expression, by the way, that comes from Sabrina. Humphrey Bogart plays Linus Larrabee. He's a big industrialist, and he gives this great speech about, it's not about money, really. That's a byproduct, he says, although obviously it's an important mechanism in all of this. But he says, what the thing is, this means that barefooted kids now have shoes and so on.
Okay.
So the invisible hand generally has that connotation of, and good things, good unintended things come from this. So it serves the good of the whole, even though the actor isn't focused on the good of the whole. And
he really, he was writing at a time, specifically in the Scottish Enlightenment, where, he had, his professor was Hutcheson, right?
Correct.
And then he traveled and he met Voltaire, and he personal friend was David Hume. So what a time to be alive.
Indeed.
And interact. What do you think, just being in that ecosystem, how did he impact, or was he impacted by those thinkers during that Enlightenment period?
Absolutely. He's very much part of the whole phenomenon. One of the interesting things about the Scottish Enlightenment and Smith, Hume, Hutcheson is that the political class, to some extent, cleared out after the Union of 1707, which is to say that after 1707, the Scottish Parliament was dissolved, and people who sat in it went and sat down in London. And I think that experience opened up cultural space for intellectuals, professors and such, which Hutcheson was, and Smith was. So you see what I'm saying? It's kind of like, there's cultural leaders in a society, and the big political leaders are part of that, of course, and exercise or exert a lot of influence. But when they suddenly kind of get shifted out of town, it opens up space for, in this case, a not governmental part of the community to maybe rise and fill some of that cultural space. And they were very much looked up to as a mountaintop in the cultural landscape of Europe, that is to say, Scotland, Edinburgh, and Glasgow.
I've read, arguments on both sides of this, but wasn't it also true that it was at the time that just mere literacy, the idea of the educated public, was becoming, the opportunity to publish books and read and get ideas out there. It was a very flourishing time for those concepts too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Literacy was very strong by any comparative measures in that area. It's part, of course, of a Protestant thing to be literate, to read the Bible directly without intermediaries necessarily. And print culture is just developing absolutely. And then periodicals of different kinds started up, The Spectator and these kinds of things in Britain.
Because wasn't his theory of moral sentiments 1750? That it was I guess what would be considered a bestseller. I mean, it sold out.
Yeah. It sold out. It did well. It was well received initially, and it had a good reputation. I don't think it was like a super, super huge thing, but it definitely established him, was well received. The early reviewers included David Hume and Edmund Burke, although those were not signed reviews.
So we talked a little bit, and fast forward to 1776, we have the theory of moral sentiments, The Wealth of Nations published, and that really, it seems, puts him on the map, and these ideas of invisible hand. And then you mentioned one as well that I think you hear at times, the idea of the impartial spectator. What did he mean? Why was he using that as an illustration, that phrase? Why did that mean so much, and why do we derive still to this day so much philosophical or engagement with that topic? Yeah,
that word is central in the theory of moral sentiments, and the expression impartial spectator actually has a number of meanings within that work. If you're at a restaurant and you have, let's say, an altercation with the server, the guy at the next table who is spectating and who evidently is impartial, not partial to you, not partial to the server, like in a kind of supposed way, there's an impartial spectator. And you do think about what it would look like to someone like that. But so it starts there. But we start to focus on people we especially admire, exemplars, and think of them as good examples of taking an impartial view of maybe more complicated moral interactions, things about our life, things about what to pursue. And so it also has a meaning there of our exemplars, people we admire and look up to. And then it also is the composite of all of that you develop within your own breast, as he puts it, the man within the breast, the conscience. That too gets called impartial spectator. But he also says that the man within the breast is a representative of a godlike beholder, universal beholder, benevolent beholder of humankind. And so that's the highest sense, God sense of impartial spectator. So actually the term has all of this whole scale, like a stairway to heaven kind of set of meanings. And they're interrelated because you go step by step, as it were, and you hope that you're improving your man within the breast as a representative of God. So they're all kind of related, but you do have to kind of keep track to some extent when you read him, which one does he mean at each point.
Interesting. So is he C.S. Lewis, right, in his book The Abolition of Man, about the head, the chest, and the belly. And the head was raw rationalism. Right. The belly was our appetites, koilia, the belly, and then the chest was that mediating. Is that a similar idea? Is that?
There is a connection there for sure. That the chest is the seat of some kind of spirit, motive. And also the sentimental element of Smith, that it's got your feeling is based on a lot of accumulated experience and thinking that you've reduced to kind of a set of impulses and reactions, again, kind of within your conscience, your sense of propriety. And so your chest sometimes informs your head. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes your chest knows better. Mm-hmm. And that's what Lewis was saying too, that we have these brainy idiots who look like they have big brains, but the only reason they look like that is because their chests are so small.
Atrophied, yeah, that's good. So he is what during his day, sometimes different writers they become more famous after their death, if you will. Mm-hmm. But was he impactful during his life? I mean, was he impacting other thinkers at the time, or was he on the just very? You had a question. There was a question in the lecture earlier about industrial revolution, and you mentioned, I mean, he was just on the very front edge of of 1800, and what was his influence?
His influence was enormous. He, as we said, he was prominent from the theory of moral sentiments, and that book made a diffuse kind of impact in his day. The Wealth of Nations was immediately very impactful. It was clear to people that he was, first of all, he was christening his politics liberal. He's very much part of this christening that happens in the 1770s. This is why we speak of classical liberalism. It's Smithian liberalism. It's what these guys meant when they spoke of liberal policy, liberal plan, liberal government, liberal principles. That's what they do. And that's why when that got turned into an ism, it was called liberalism, like in Gladstone. And so that's, classical liberalism. And that.
So let me just, can I stop you right there real quick? Some people might think, conservative, progressive, or liberal, conservative, in that, what is there can you define classical liberalism in a way? Is that, because that's not the right way to think about it, right? The left versus the right.
Classical liberalism would certainly be more associated today in America with the right, if you had to say the right or the left, I feel. Smith put it this way: allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So the basic principle you get from the Wealth of Nations in terms of a kind of policy direction or presumption is leave people free, okay? And this whole discussion in the Wealth of Nations presupposes a stable polity, a nation state, if you like. And that's not a small thing to presuppose, realize. I mean, Britain was kind of out front on that. And so a lot of the world was just still trying to get a stable, integrated polity going, like a nation or something going. So that's why one reason why it's much messier elsewhere, outside the Anglosphere. But basically, it's saying, assuming a stable polity, a stable government and everything, basically the presumption should be smaller government, not interfering, not taxing, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. So I would say that Smith's classical liberalism is against the governmentalization of social affairs. I use the term governmentalization because I want to speak not only of interventions and restrictions on individuals, but also government playing large roles because they tax people or because they enjoy other sorts of privileges that make big government players in society, which governmentalizes social affairs because we have such big government players. I think classical liberalism is generally against big government.
And thereby leaving people less free. So the bigger the government gets, the more control. Is that how the argument flows?
It's not just less free. I mean, it does make – the restrictions and stuff and higher taxes do directly make people less free. But also just it stinks. I think Smith thinks that big government or the governmentalization of social affairs is bad. Mm-hmm. It's better not to be. And I certainly believe that too. I think even in the theory of moral sentiments, he's arguing that a great deal, although sometimes kind of in a subtle, indirect way.
And if I understand right, though, he's not anti-government, right? I mean, he doesn't think there should be no governing bodies or no laws or legislation.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct. He's very much pro-authority and stability, as is David Hume and Edmund Burke, his buddies. And in certain respects, it's proper, I think, to call it a conservative liberalism, where they don't want to screw with that, with whatever it is that enables you to suppose a stable polity, because you can do things that upset that stability. And politics can be crazy, as they saw, as even Smith began to see just before he died in 1790. I mean, he saw it in other ways, of course, throughout his life, for sure. But then the French Revolution, Burke especially saw and commented on, of course.
Mm-hmm. So you use Smith in your lecture earlier today. You Smith was kind of near the end because you wanted to show what created the environment or the ecosystem to allow Smith to write and to think in the way he did. And it was kind of revolving around the idea of Larry Siedentop's book, Inventing the Individual. Can you just give us a brief thesis of that idea?
Christianity made liberalism possible. That's the idea. No Christianity, no liberalism. That's not to say that Christianity necessarily leads to liberalism. It did not in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Christianity. But it made liberalism possible because the ontological elements of Christianity and the moral intuitions that come with all of that invent the individual. They kind of create the individual. It's an elaborate story. An important element, though, in understanding this idea of what Siedentop is saying is that it hasn't always been like this. Like, we take so much for granted, and rather our history and past in many ways is a society, a social situation that is very cultish. Mm-hmm. And whether that is the hunter-gatherer band of our Paleolithic past, which I think is still in our genes, or the ancient world, as Siedentop puts it. You can think of ancient Greece and Rome, where you have this compound of nested cults down to the family. The family, in fact, was a cult, and the paterfamilias was a priest. And so you got to realize that it was actually a very religious society. It's just that they may not have taken, Zeus or Jupiter all that seriously, but it was still actually a compound of nested cults.
And that might be unfamiliar for so when you mean cult, I mean that's what culture. That's what do you mean by cult?
It's culture, but it's very much like sacred elements,
cultus,
and built into daily practice, daily understanding, and direct social signals that are consensus-oriented and immediately observable. Mm-hmm. And Christianity turned that upside down in a lot of ways and stepped outside of that, often very visibly, for example, with martyrs or hermits or anchorites and such, which actually kind of impressed people. All of a sudden, these people outside the cult, and hence an idiot, were kind of like impressing people and actually starting to win people over because they had a whole way of making sense now with these different ontology and different intuitions that began to make sense. But it took so long for these intuitions to play out, to get translated into social experience, social practice, and politics. And Siedentop is arguing, and I agree with him, that this actually made possible the whole liberal development of Western Europe.
And when you say, so the idea, other writers have used the term kin or tribal, so what you're saying is, or the cult, you've moved from that Christianity allows somebody to move from the cultist to the individual. Is that what like it helped develop the concept?
That's
of
correct. That's correct. There's a standing of an individual before God, not mediated. In fact, sometimes called upon to defy their family and so on, defy their city even. That's the martyr, right? And similarly, this pattern before God gets kind of translated so that now under Caesar, it's not the family that's the unit of subjection, it's the individual. Now, talking about subjection may not sound very, classical liberal, but in fact, it recognizes now the individual and hence the individual's interests and rights and standing before God. So you don't trample here. And in fact, Caesar is just another creature of God with the same kind of responsibilities to God, which means not screwing with the other creatures of God and abusing them, including people of other countries and regions. Of course, this isn't necessarily the way Christianity looked over hundreds of years, but we do get a liberal vein ramifying out of this. Mm-hmm. And Siedentop's arguing that you needed this Christian stuff to get it to get that to even come into existence.
So is he? I mean, theologically, if you think about, I mean, the general Christian idea is that the individual was oriented or should be oriented towards God. So there is an element of individual, but I mean, the idea of community or being a part of the body, like in New Testament scriptures, the idea of being a part of the body of Christ that's a whether somebody's an eye or an ear, there's an element of being a part. There's a communitarianness embedded in Christianity.
Absolutely.
And so is this kind of a sociological observation? I mean, because it seems like there might be just a little rub theologically with somebody being a raw individual.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the individualism is that we are each of us is constituted as individual organisms, but our orientation, our duty is to the whole. And so that's not individualistic. But still, the reality is we are constituted as individual organisms. And that puts limits on how to get stuff done, how stuff plays out, what can be trusted and so on. And really there it's where the whole understanding, you're kind of called by God to learn how things work. And so learning, thinking becomes kind of an imperative. And the way we're constituted as individuals means that sometimes it's much better to let individuals do things, allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way, as Smith elaborates in The Wealth of Nations. But, there's a long tradition of thinking along those ways and the merits of the individual. So, you see, your duty is to the good of the whole, but you don't necessarily focus on the good of the whole. There's a moral authorization that comes to focus on the things that your efforts are actually effective in. Effective. And effectiveness depends a great deal on knowledge and control. And that's so limited to us organisms. Right? I mean, and it's natural for you to say, okay, Dan, you take responsibility for that body of your, the hand, and then the things and we extend the idea of ownership to other objects of property. And this is the only way to do it. And this is partly, again, developing it into liberalism through jurisprudence, by the way, because jurisprudence, which is very much part of God's path, develops ideas about property, about agreement, contract, about what messing with those things looks like and is therefore frowned upon. So you kind of square the paradox that you raise about individual and collective with this liberal approach, classical liberal approach.
Because it seems like one of the arguments or counterexamples is today, if you look at modernity, what we are now, whatever age we're in, it seems like there's a problem of radical individualism, and that so if you were to say everyone is his own, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, theologically, there seems to be a moral grounding in the person and work and the text and of a Christian identity. And there's a moral grounding in text and in a person, Jesus Christ, that kind of argument or angle. And what is the grounding or moral grounding for this? If everybody is, just radically free, what kind of helps ground so that there is if I'm understanding it, like a common good?
Yeah.
If everybody is radically free, what is the grounding that allows people to get along?
You would hope it would be appreciation of certain traditions, customs, moral leaders of different kinds, including religious ones, that would cohere and would be worthy moral leaders and influences. That's not the way it's going, evidently, obviously. But that's the way it did go for a while and worked out, I would say, pretty well. We had a good thing going. Doesn't really look that way overall at the present, but things can turn around. Who knows? I don't know what else to say. There's no other guarantees. Everything's not upward.
Sure. And your recent article, I believe it was for AIER, right? About the baby in the bathwater.
They reprinted it. It was started off at Law and Liberty.
Oh, at Law and Liberty. Okay. Because you draw out that concept of why religion is important to these conversations.
Yes.
And we'll link to that as well in the show notes so that people can see how you unpack that a little bit with Daniel Mahoney, I believe, is your
Correct.
co-author. Because it seems to me like the vague or fuzziness of a higher power or that language in if you go to a religion like Islam or Christianity, that there are rootednesses, there are texts, there are theologies, if you will, that one can point to and say this is why we believe X. But then when that the vague secular kind of freedom and individual, that there isn't a lot of moral or it seems fuzzier to have any kind of moral grounding with raw individualism. Am I thinking about that wrongly, or?
I think vagueness is something we are to some extent stuck with either way. Actually, I don't think interpretation of Scripture is all that precise and accurate and all that definite or definitive. So, and I'm piggybacking here, particularly on some of my co-authors and colleagues who are Christians, who would, I think, say similarly. So that's the thing. I mean, as much as the Scripture is enriching and should be venerated, I don't think it. I mean, the Ten Commandments are one thing, but more generally speaking, it's not it's not a grammar. It's not like a grammar exactly. I mean, the Ten Commandments are, but most of it is not like that. And so, I think we need interpreters, culture, leaders, exemplars, traditions to guide us, to keep us on an upward path. Either way you look at it, however you look at it, however theistic your society is, that's where hope's got to lie. That is to say, good moral institutions and leadership and so on. Yeah. Government's a big player, and unfortunately, it's very, very dangerous in this respect.
So this idea of individual, Adam Smith obviously takes that concept and tries to build it into, specifically in The Wealth of Nations, the idea of how economy is. I mean, is it, what is he called? The father of modern economics or the father of capitalism? I mean, you see these different terms used. Where do you think – I was intrigued by your answer to the question during the lecture on the idea that he might have foreseen or did he – I mean, it unleashed 200 years, give or take, of, extreme economic growth. But it also, it hasn't been a perfect – just because we're wealthier doesn't mean we're better. I mean, wealthier nations have less babies. They have there are counterexamples. Where are we now with Adam Smith's project? What would you, if Adam Smith were to look back – or
Adam
to
Smith,
look forward, if you will.
Adam Smith never promised happiness, and he never promised unmitigated blessings from the liberal plan. Not at all. In fact, both of his works end on a kind of dour note, and that kind of relates here. There's just the development of modern civilization just involves a kind of complexification of social life, an enrichment and refinement of everything, a kind of dividing and subdividing, separate and detached items that get combined. And this process, which is very, old for hundreds and hundreds of years of becoming more and more this way, is very different than a lot of our natural instincts, which goes back to this whole business about our past. But it's not necessarily going to be satisfying. And he well understands that just because you have greater wealth and washing machines and everything, that you're not necessarily better off. He thinks moral condition, after some basic, material, moral condition is the primary matter of your well-being, moral condition. He says, what can be added to the happiness of man who is in good health, out of debt, and has a clear conscience? So it's mainly about the clear conscience,
Classic, yeah.
And that's where the moral, it's all moral condition. So Smith, you should be careful not to misrepresent Smith as having promised happiness, as not having focused on material well-being as what is all important. Do I think he expected? Well, let's just say backpedaling, or what's the right word? Moving downward. I would say Smith, if he saw the world today, he would feel that in many respects, it's been a downward moral movement. I think he would say that, and I'm talking about in Britain, in the United States. And I think I would say that, actually. And I do think we're, in some sense, less well-off, less happy, and less good, and less virtuous, on the whole, just generalizing. I don't think he would have been surprised. I don't think he would have predicted it necessarily. He didn't make any kind of predictions along those lines. And what he said about governmentalization being to the bad was true then. Mm-hmm. It's still true today. And so if we're going to do what God wants to, what serves the good of the whole and get God's approval, we should continue to point that out. That governmentalization is still to the bad. Mm-hmm. And if people aren't listening, well, all we can do is what we can do.
No, that's good. What would be, to close our ideas and our time together, what would be a few places if somebody wanted to read a little bit more about Adam Smith? What would be, do you have a favorite Adam Smith book or biography or explanation of his work?
Yeah. For someone who, first of all, I think it's really good to read his words. Mm-hmm. And there's a book called The Wisdom of Adam Smith that Liberty Fund put out. Ben Rogie edited it, and it's very good, and it's got quotes, and I strongly encourage that as a kind of primer to get acquainted, and you're going to come across many of the most famous and important passages there, and from the Theory of Moral Sentiments as well. It's not just The Wealth of Nations by any means. So that, I think that might be the best way to get into it, but I would encourage people to have the ambition to read the two great works. I think The Wealth of Nations is much easier to read, even though it's much longer. Yeah. But I do think The Theory of Moral Sentiments is a greater work, as Smith did.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay. That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't know if you know, the Acton Institute was founded for several reasons, but one of the main ones is Father Sirico had asked several of his Catholic friends coming out of seminary, or he was aware of, it didn't seem like there was any economic education in Catholic seminaries. And so he asked some of his Protestant friends, is there much economic engagement in Protestant seminaries? And there just wasn't. And so he saw that there was this outsized influence of religious thinkers on they have a platform to share and to talk about these ideas, but there might not have been a lot of knowledge around the idea of economics. And the reason I got introduced to Acton 17 years ago was I was in a seminary, and they came and did a conference. And I remember reading a section of Adam Smith for the very first time. I literally can remember where I was and starting to think through some of Adam Smith's concepts. And so for me, in my own journey, where later I worked at a Christian college, and I created a class called God, Wealth, and the Church, to talk through some of these ideas, to try to be a remedial idea of what is economics, what does God think about it, and I think Adam Smith has a lot to say. So thank you for bringing your expertise, Dan, to the lecture series and to the podcast, and we're really delighted you're here.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.